The pitch came during Sunday dinner at my parents' house, right after we'd finished my mother's famous pot roast, and my father had poured everyone a second glass of wine, and we were all settled into that comfortable post-meal contentment where everything feels warm and safe and family. And my younger brother Ryan was talking about his new business venture with the kind of enthusiasm I hadn't seen from him in years. And I was genuinely happy to see him so excited about something because Ryan had been drifting for a while, jumping from job to job, never quite finding his footing. And here he was at 35, finally seeming to have found his purpose in real estate investment and house flipping. He'd been talking about it for months, how he'd been studying the market, learning about renovations, connecting with contractors. And now he said he'd found the perfect property and he needed investors, and he wanted to keep it in the family. My name is Claudia Morrison, and I'm 40 years old, and I'm a successful patent attorney, and I've always been the responsible one, the one who made good decisions and built a stable life. And I've always felt protective of Ryan even though he's only 5 years younger. And when he asked me to invest in his house flip, I wanted so badly to support him that I ignored every instinct telling me to be careful. Ryan pulled out his phone and started showing us photos of the property, a rundown Victorian house in a neighborhood that was up and coming. He said he'd gotten it for a steal at a foreclosure auction, paid $120,000 for a house that would be worth $400,000 once renovated. He had blueprints and contractor quotes and a detailed timeline. He said the renovation would take 4 to 6 months and cost about $200,000 all in. And once completed, they could sell it for somewhere between $450,000 and $500,000. He said he'd already put in $30,000 of his own money for the down payment and closing costs, but he needed additional capital for the renovation. He was looking for investors who'd put in anywhere from $50,000 to $200,000, and he'd give them a percentage of the profits proportional to their investment. My parents were immediately interested. My father asked about the numbers, and Ryan walked him through a detailed spreadsheet showing projected costs and returns. My mother asked about the neighborhood, and Ryan pulled up articles about development in the area. New restaurants opening, young families moving in, property values increasing. It all sounded legitimate and well-researched. I asked Ryan about his experience with house flipping since this would be his first project, and he said he'd been apprenticing with an experienced flipper named Marcus Chen for the past year, learning the business, understanding the pitfalls, and Marcus had looked at this property and confirmed it was a solid investment. He said Marcus would be advising on the project and had connected him with reliable contractors. I asked if I could meet Marcus, and Ryan said sure, absolutely, he'd set up a meeting. I asked about the timeline for returns, and Ryan said realistically, we'd see our money back with profits in about 8 to 10 months, 6 months for renovation and a couple months to sell. He said the housing market was hot right now, and houses in that neighborhood were selling within weeks of being listed. My father said he and my mother wanted to invest $50,000 from their retirement savings. They'd been looking for better returns than their savings account was giving them, and this seemed like a good opportunity to help Ryan and make some money. Ryan hugged them and said he wouldn't let them down. This was going to be the start of something big. He could feel it. I went home that night and talked it over with my husband, David. I told him about Ryan's proposal and showed him the materials Ryan had sent me, the property photos, the renovation plans, the financial projections. David is a software engineer, and he's analytical and careful with money. He looked through everything and said it looks legitimate on paper, but do we really trust Ryan with this kind of money? And I said that was my concern too. Ryan had never managed anything of this scale before. He had no track record, but I also said I wanted to support him. He seemed genuinely committed this time, and if we didn't invest and it succeeded, we'd always regret not believing in him. David said, how much were we thinking? And I said maybe 50,000, enough to show support, but not so much that we'd be devastated if something went wrong. David thought about it and said okay, but we should do due diligence first. Meet this Marcus person, maybe visit the property. See the scope of work ourselves, and I agreed. I texted Ryan and said I was interested in investing, but wanted to meet with him and Marcus first to discuss the details. The meeting happened the following week at a coffee shop downtown. Ryan showed up with a guy he introduced as Marcus Chen. mid-40s, well-dressed, professional demeanor. Marcus shook my hand and said, "Ryan's told me a lot about you. Corporate attorney, right?" And I corrected him, patent attorney, and he said, right. Well, it's great that Ryan has family support for this venture. Family money is often the smartest money in real estate because there's built-in trust. I asked Marcus about his experience, and he said he'd been flipping houses for 12 years, started small with condos and worked his way up to larger properties. He currently had 3 projects going, and he'd agreed to mentor Ryan on this first flip. I asked why he wasn't investing in Ryan's project himself if it was such a good deal. And Marcus said he had all his capital tied up in his current projects, but he'd looked at the numbers and the property and he thought Ryan had found a winner. He said the key to successful flipping is buying below market value, and Ryan had done that. The neighborhood was definitely trending upward, and as long as they didn't overspend on renovations, the profit margin was solid. I asked to see the property and Ryan seemed hesitant. He said it wasn't really safe to walk through yet. There were structural issues and the floors weren't stable, but I could drive by and see it from the outside. I said I'd like to do that, so we all got in our cars and drove to the address Ryan had listed. It was in a neighborhood I wasn't familiar with, older houses, some fixed up nicely and some rundown. We pulled up to a Victorian house that matched the photos Ryan had shown us. It was clearly in rough shape, peeling paint, boarded windows, overgrown yard. There was a for sale sign in the yard that had been partially torn down. Ryan said he'd bought it so fast they hadn't had time to remove all the signage. I got out and walked around the outside. The foundation looked solid. The roof needed replacing. There was obvious water damage on some of the exterior walls. It was definitely a fixer-upper, but I could see the potential. The bones were good, and the neighborhood did seem to be improving. There were renovated houses on the same block. I felt my reservations starting to ease. We went back to the coffee shop, and I told Ryan I was in for $150,000. It was more than I'd originally planned, but I was feeling confident after seeing the property and meeting Marcus. Ryan's eyes lit up and he hugged me and said, "You won't regret this, Claudia. I'm going to make us both a lot of money." We drew up a simple investment agreement. Ryan had a template that Marcus had given him. It outlined the investment amount, the expected return, the timeline. And both of our signatures, I had David look it over, and he said it seemed standard for this kind of partnership agreement. I transferred the money to Ryan's business account the next day, $150,000 that represented a significant chunk of our savings, money we'd been setting aside for our daughter's college fund and our eventual retirement. But I told myself it was a good investment. We'd get it back with profit in less than a year. And I was helping my brother achieve his dream. The first month went smoothly. Ryan sent regular updates. He said he'd hired a contractor team and they'd started demolition. He sent photos of the interior being gutted, walls torn down, old fixtures removed. It looked like real progress was being made. He said they'd found some additional issues during demolition, some electrical wiring that needed to be completely redone, some plumbing that was worse than expected. This meant extra costs, but he'd budgeted for contingencies. I asked how much extra, and he said probably another $20,000. I asked where that money was coming from, and he said he'd secured a small business loan to cover overages. He didn't want to ask investors for more money on his first project. I was impressed by his professionalism and his commitment to protecting our investment. My parents were getting similar updates, and they were thrilled. They told everyone they knew about Ryan's business venture, how proud they were that he'd finally found his calling. Month 2, the updates continued. Ryan sent photos of new framing going in, electrical work being done. He said the contractor had hit a snag with permits. Apparently the city was backlogged, and it was taking longer than expected to get approval for some of the structural changes. This meant delays, but he was handling it. He'd hired a permit expediter to push things through. I asked if I could visit the site and see the progress in person, and Ryan said the contractor preferred not to have visitors while they were working, liability issues. But once they got to the finishes stage, I could come tour it. I accepted this explanation, though part of me felt like I should push harder to see the property. But I reminded myself that I'd invested in Ryan, not just the house. I needed to trust him to manage the project. Month 3, Ryan said they were making great progress. The electrical and plumbing were done. They were moving on to drywall and finish work. He sent photos of rooms taking shape, new walls smooth and painted, new fixtures being installed. The photos looked professional and impressive. He said they were still on track to finish in another 2 to 3 months. The market was still hot, and his realtor had already had inquiries from potential buyers even though the house wasn't listed yet. He said we might even get more than the projected selling price, maybe pushing $550,000, which would mean bigger returns for everyone. I was excited and relieved. It seemed like everything was going according to plan. I told David that maybe we should invest in Ryan's next project too. This could be a really good revenue stream for us. It was week 14 when I decided to surprise Ryan at the property. I'd been in that neighborhood for a client meeting, and I thought I'd swing by and see the renovation progress even if I couldn't go inside. I wanted to see the outside transformed, maybe catch a glimpse through the windows. I pulled up to the address and my stomach dropped. The house looked exactly the same as it had 3 months ago when I'd first seen it. Same boarded windows, same peeling paint, same overgrown yard. There were no contractor vehicles, no dumpster, no signs of any work being done. I got out of my car and walked closer. I tried to look through gaps in the boards covering the windows, but I couldn't see much. I walked around to the back and found a window that wasn't fully boarded. I peered inside, and what I saw made my blood run cold. The interior was completely untouched. No demolition, no new framing, no electrical work, nothing. It looked exactly like an abandoned house that hadn't been touched in years. Walls still up, old fixtures still in place, everything covered in dust and debris. I stood there trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Maybe this wasn't the right house. Maybe I'd gotten the address wrong. I checked the property address on my phone against the investment agreement. It matched. This was definitely the house. I called Ryan immediately, and he didn't answer. I called again, and it went to voicemail. I texted him saying I was at the property and needed to talk to him urgently. No response. I sat in my car outside that house for 30 minutes trying to figure out what was happening. Were the photos he'd been sending from a different property? Was there some explanation I wasn't seeing? Had the contractor abandoned the job? My mind was racing through possibilities, but none of them made sense. Finally, I decided to go to the county recorder's office and pull the property records. I needed to understand what was going on. At the recorder's office, I requested all documents related to the property address. The clerk pulled up the records and printed them out for me, and what I found made me feel physically sick. The property had been sold at foreclosure auction 13 months ago, not 3 months ago like Ryan had said. It had been purchased by Ryan Morrison for $110,000. That part was true. But then 6 months later, Ryan had sold the property to a house flipping company for $105,000, taking a $5,000 loss. The current owner was listed as Prestige Property Investments, LLC. Ryan hadn't owned this property for 7 months. Everything he'd told us about buying it recently and renovating it was a complete lie. The photos he'd been sending must have been from somewhere else, maybe from Marcus's projects or pulled from the internet. I sat in my car in the parking lot of the recorder's office, and I felt like my entire reality was shattering. I called Ryan again, and this time he answered. His voice was casual and upbeat. "Hey, Claudia, what's up?" And I said I'm sitting outside the property, Ryan, and there was silence. And then he said, yeah, I was going to tell you, there's been a slight delay with the contractor. And I said, Ryan, I'm looking at property records that show you sold this house 6 months ago. You don't own it anymore, more silence. And then he said I can explain, and I said you better start explaining right now. He said, can we meet in person? This isn't really a phone conversation. And I said no. You explain to me right now where my $150,000 is. His voice changed, got quieter. He said I made some mistakes, Claudia. I'm going to fix it. I just need a little more time. And I said, what kind of mistakes? Where is the money? And he said I had some debts, some things I needed to take care of. I used the investment money to handle some personal issues, but I'm going to pay it back. I promise. I was so angry I was shaking. I said you took my money under false pretenses. You showed me a house you didn't own. You sent me fake progress photos. You lied to me for months. That's fraud, Ryan. That's a crime. And he started crying, saying he was sorry, he'd made terrible choices. He was in trouble and he panicked. He thought he could fix it before anyone found out. I hung up on him and immediately called my parents. I needed to know if they'd given Ryan money too. My mother answered, and I said, "Mom, did you and Dad invest in Ryan's house flip?" And she said, "Yes, of course. We gave him $50,000. Why, what's wrong?" I told her everything, the property records, the fake renovation, Ryan admitting he'd used the money for personal debts. My mother started crying. She said, "That's our retirement money. How could he do this?" I said, "I don't know, Mom, but I'm going to find out. I'm going to figure out where all the money went and I'm going to get it back." She said, "Should we call the police?" And I said, "Yes, we should. But first I want to do some investigating. I want to know the full scope of what Ryan's done before we involve authorities." I spent the next week digging into Ryan's finances, and what I found was so much worse than I'd imagined. I hired a private investigator named Susan Marks who specializes in financial fraud. I gave her everything I had and asked her to trace where the money went. Susan came back to me 5 days later with a report that made me want to scream. Ryan had approached not just me and my parents, but also our Aunt Linda, our Uncle James, our cousin Michelle, and 2 family friends. He'd given them all the same pitch, showed them the same house, promised the same returns. In total, he'd collected $627,000 from family and friends. None of it had gone to any house renovation. Some of it had gone to paying off credit card debt Ryan had accumulated, about $80,000 worth. Some had gone to paying his rent and living expenses for the past year, about $40,000. But the vast majority of it, nearly $500,000, had gone to casinos in Las Vegas. Susan had gotten Ryan's bank records through some investigative methods I didn't ask too many questions about. She showed me statements showing hundreds of transactions at Vegas casinos, MGM Grand, Caesars Palace, Bellagio, cash withdrawals from casino ATMs, thousands of dollars at a time, wire transfers to online gambling sites. It was devastating to see. Ryan had a serious gambling problem, and he'd funded it by defrauding his own family. Susan said this was a classic pattern. Gambling addicts often turn to fraud when they run out of legitimate money. They convince themselves they'll win it back and pay everyone back before anyone notices. But they never win. The house always wins, and they just dig themselves deeper. I called a family meeting. I told my parents and aunt and uncle that we all needed to talk about Ryan. I didn't tell them what I'd found because I wanted to see if any of them would admit they'd given him money. We met at my parents' house on a Saturday afternoon, and I started by saying I've discovered that Ryan defrauded me. He took my money for a fake house flip and spent it. I know Mom and Dad invested too. Did anyone else give Ryan money? The room went silent, and then my Aunt Linda started crying. She said I gave him $75,000. He said he'd double it in 6 months. My Uncle James said I gave him $100,000. I was trying to help him get started. My cousin Michelle said I gave him $50,000 from my divorce settlement. It was all I had. One of the family friends said I gave him $40,000, and the other said I gave him $82,000. I did the math out loud. That's $597,000 from everyone here, plus my $150 makes $747,000 total. Does anyone else know of other investors? Everyone shook their heads. I showed them the private investigator's report. I showed them the property records proving Ryan didn't own the house. I showed them the bank statements showing the Vegas transactions. I watched my family's faces as they processed what I was telling them. My father looked like he'd aged 10 years in 10 seconds. My mother was sobbing. My Aunt Linda was hyperventilating. My Uncle James was turning red with rage. My cousin Michelle just sat there in shock. I said we need to decide what we're going to do. We can file a police report and pursue criminal charges. We can file a civil lawsuit to try to recover the money, or we can do both. My Uncle James said we should do both. Ryan needs to face consequences. My mother said he's sick. He has a gambling addiction. He needs help, not prison. And I said he can get help in prison, Mom. What he did is illegal. He committed fraud. He stole from his own family. We can't just sweep this under the rug because he has a problem. The debate went on for 2 hours. My mother and father wanted to give Ryan a chance to get treatment and pay the money back. They didn't want to see their son in prison. My aunt and uncle wanted him prosecuted to the full extent of the law. They were furious and wanted justice. My cousin Michelle was somewhere in between. She wanted her money back, but she also felt sorry for Ryan. I said, here's what I think we should do. We should confront Ryan together, all of us. We should tell him we know everything and give him one chance to come clean and agree to get help. If he refuses, or if he lies to us again, then we go to the police. Everyone agreed to this plan. I called Ryan and told him the family needed to meet with him. He tried to make excuses, but I said it's not optional, Ryan. You either show up tomorrow at 1 p.m. at Mom and Dad's house, or we're calling the police right now. He said okay. He'd be there. Ryan showed up the next day looking terrible. He hadn't slept. His eyes were red. He'd clearly been crying. We all sat around my parents' living room and I started. I said, Ryan, we've all compared notes, and we know you defrauded at least 7 people for over $700,000. We know you don't own the property you claim to be renovating. We know you spent the money at casinos in Vegas. We have bank records. We have property records. We have evidence of everything. I asked him to tell us the truth, all of it, no more lies. He sat there and cried, and then he started talking. He said he'd developed a gambling problem about 3 years ago, started with online poker, and then escalated to regular trips to Vegas. He'd lost all his own money and maxed out his credit cards. He was desperate and drowning in debt. He'd heard about house flipping and thought maybe he could use that as a cover to get money from family. He'd bought the property with borrowed money thinking he'd renovate and flip it, and make enough to pay everyone back and solve his debt problem. But then he lost the borrowed money at a casino. He couldn't afford the mortgage on the property, so he sold it at a loss. By then he'd already told everyone about the investment opportunity. He thought if he could just get money from family, he could go to Vegas and win big and pay everyone back, and no one would ever know. But he kept losing. He said every time he lost, he thought the next trip would be different. The next hand would be the winner. He chased his losses over and over. He said he knew what he was doing was wrong, but he couldn't stop himself. The gambling addiction had complete control of him. He said he was so ashamed, and he didn't know how to get out of it. He said he'd thought about killing himself multiple times over the past few months. My mother gasped and went to hug him, but I stopped her. I said, Ryan, admitting you have a problem doesn't undo what you did. You stole from your family, you lied to us for months. You spent money that people needed. Aunt Linda's retirement savings, Michelle's divorce settlement, money people trusted you with. He said, I know, and I'll spend the rest of my life making it up to you. I'll get a job. I'll pay everyone back. I'll do whatever it takes. My Uncle James said how. You owe $700,000. You don't have a job. You don't have any assets. How exactly are you going to pay that back? Ryan didn't have an answer. I said, here's what's going to happen. You're going to check yourself into a gambling addiction treatment program today. Residential treatment for at least 90 days. You're going to sign over any assets you have to begin paying back what you owe. And you're going to agree to a structured repayment plan. If you do all of that, we'll hold off on filing criminal charges. But if you refuse any of this, or if you relapse or disappear, we go to the police immediately. Ryan agreed to everything. My parents paid for him to go to a treatment facility in Arizona that specializes in gambling addiction. He left that same day. I worked with a lawyer to draft a repayment agreement. Ryan had almost no assets, a car worth maybe $8,000 and some personal belongings. We sold everything and put it toward the debt, which left about $712,000 still owed. While Ryan was in treatment, I continued investigating because something wasn't adding up. The bank records showed about $500,000 went to gambling, but that left over $200,000 unaccounted for. I went back to Susan, the private investigator, and asked her to dig deeper. She came back with more bad news. Ryan had a girlfriend none of us knew about. Her name was Tanya, and she lived in Vegas. He'd been flying out to see her every few weeks. He'd rented her an apartment. Bought her a car. Given her cash, Susan estimated he'd spent at least $150,000 on Tanya over the past year. When I showed this to the family, my Uncle James exploded. He said so not only was Ryan gambling away our money, but he was spending it on some Vegas girlfriend. This is insane. I said I'm going to Vegas to talk to this Tanya. I want to see if she has any assets that we can recover. My father said I'll come with you. We flew to Vegas and found Tanya's apartment. When she opened the door and we explained who we were, she looked genuinely shocked. She said she had no idea Ryan had scammed his family. He'd told her he was a successful real estate investor. He'd been so generous with her, and she thought he was just wealthy. She said she felt terrible and she wanted to help. She showed us the car Ryan had bought her, a BMW worth about $40,000, and she said she'd return it. She also had jewelry and designer bags he'd bought her. She gave us all of it. She said she didn't want anything from Ryan if it was stolen money. We asked if she knew about his gambling, and she said yes. She'd been with him at casinos many times. She'd tried to get him to stop, but he was obsessed. She said she'd fallen in love with him and thought she could help him, but she realized now he'd just been using her too, just like he'd used all of us. We sold the BMW and the jewelry and recovered about $68,000 from Tanya. It was something, but it barely made a dent in the total amount owed. Ryan completed his 90 days in treatment and came back to our city. He looked healthier, he'd gained weight. He seemed clearer and more present. He attended Gamblers Anonymous meetings every day. He got a job working at a warehouse making $15 an hour. He moved into a tiny studio apartment. He started making payments on the debt, $50 a week, which at that rate would take him about 270 years to pay off the remaining debt. It was insulting. My Uncle James said, "This is ridiculous. We need to press charges. He's not making any real effort to pay us back," but my parents begged us to give Ryan more time. They said he was trying. He was in recovery. We couldn't destroy his life over a mistake. The breaking point came 4 months after Ryan got out of treatment. My cousin Michelle called me in tears saying she'd seen Ryan at a casino. She'd been there for a work conference, and she'd spotted him at a blackjack table. He'd relapsed. He was gambling again. I called Ryan immediately and confronted him. At first he denied it, but then he admitted he'd been going to casinos once or twice a week. He said he was only playing with small amounts, $20 or $30. He had it under control. I said, "You don't have it under control, Ryan. You're an addict. You're supposed to be in recovery. You promised us you'd stop." He said it was just a little bit. It wasn't hurting anyone, and I said, "It's hurting everyone. You're supposed to be paying us back, and instead you're gambling again. That's it, I'm filing a police report." He begged me not to, said he'd stop again. He'd go back to treatment. But I said, "No, you've had your chances. You've lied too many times. I can't trust anything you say anymore." I filed a police report detailing everything. The fraud, the fake house flip, the amount stolen, the gambling, the relapse. I provided all the evidence Susan had gathered. The bank records, the property records, statements from all the victims. The police took it seriously and opened a criminal investigation. They arrested Ryan 2 weeks later and charged him with multiple counts of fraud and theft. The amount involved made it a felony. He was facing up to 20 years in prison. My parents were devastated, but even they had to admit that Ryan had brought this on himself. He'd been given every opportunity to make things right, and he'd chosen to keep gambling instead. The criminal trial took 8 months. Ryan's public defender tried to argue that gambling addiction was a mitigating factor, and that Ryan deserved treatment, not prison. The prosecutor argued that Ryan had deliberately and systematically defrauded his own family, that he'd created an elaborate scheme with fake documents and fake updates, that this wasn't a crime of passion, but a calculated plan. The judge agreed with the prosecution. Ryan was sentenced to 12 years in federal prison. He'd be eligible for parole after 8 years, but only if he showed remorse and completed addiction treatment programs while incarcerated. My parents attended the sentencing, and my mother sobbed through the whole thing. My father just sat there stone-faced. I felt sad, but also relieved. Finally, there were consequences. Finally, Ryan was being held accountable. The civil lawsuit was more complicated. We formed what's called a class action with all 7 victims. We sued Ryan for the full amount plus interest and legal fees. The judgment was in our favor, but collecting it was nearly impossible. Ryan had no assets, no income beyond prison work that paid pennies per hour. The lawyer said we could garnish any future wages or assets, but realistically we'd probably never recover more than a small fraction of what was owed. My parents lost $50,000 of their retirement savings. I lost $150,000. My aunt and uncle lost $175,000 combined. Michelle lost $50,000. The family friends lost $122,000. All of it gone, gambled away or spent on a Vegas girlfriend. The financial damage was devastating, but the emotional damage was worse. Our family was fractured. We barely spoke at holidays. There was too much pain and anger and resentment. My parents visit Ryan in prison every month. They've forgiven him because they say he's their son and they love him despite what he did. I haven't visited him once and I don't plan to. I can't forgive what he did to me, to our family, to people who trusted him. My Aunt Linda had to postpone her retirement by 10 years because of the money she lost. Michelle had to move back in with her parents because she lost her divorce settlement. The family friends are suing my parents, claiming they should have known Ryan was troubled and shouldn't have enabled his pitch to invest. It's a mess that will take years or maybe decades to fully resolve. Ryan sends letters from prison apologizing and saying he's working on himself. I throw them away without reading them. I don't care about his apologies. I care about the $150,000 I'll never get back. The college fund I had to rebuild from scratch. The trust that was destroyed. I've learned hard lessons from this experience. I learned that you can love someone and still hold them accountable. I learned that addiction doesn't excuse criminal behavior. I learned that trust but verify isn't just a business principle, but a family one too. I learned that sometimes the people who hurt us most are the ones we're trying to help. My brother asked me to invest in his house flip, and I drove by the renovation site to find the house had been sold a year earlier. I discovered he'd scammed the entire family for over $600,000 to fund a gambling addiction. I reported him to the police and testified at his trial, and he's now serving 12 years in federal prison. My family may never recover financially or emotionally from what Ryan did, but at least he's facing consequences and can't hurt anyone else for a while. That's my story, and I share it as a warning. When family asks you for money, get everything in writing. Verify everything independently, and don't let love blind you to red flags, because the people who know how much you love them are often the ones who know exactly how to manipulate that love. And by the time you realize what's happening, the money is already gone and the damage is already done. I ignored my instincts because I wanted to support my brother, and it cost me everything. Don't make the same mistake I did. Trust is precious, and once it's broken, it can never be fully repaired. Ryan broke our family's trust and destroyed our relationships for money he gambled away in Vegas. And now he's in prison, and we're left picking up the pieces of the wreckage he left behind. Some mistakes you can come back from and some you can't. Ryan's crossed a line that can never be uncrossed, and he'll have to live with that for the rest of his life. Just like we'll have to live with the consequences of trusting him when we shouldn't have.